Good day, Internet. This is Chavez and Valko, the key to your immigration solutions. I am Senior Associate Ben Hamilton, and with me today, as always, is Associate Attorney Andrew Craven. Andrew, I see that you've taken up the piano since we last talked.
Yeah, working from home, so on my break, I just head over, tickle the ivory for a bit, and mostly Yankee Doodle Dandy is my go-to.
Well, we're doing this video from home today because there is snow in the forecast for Texas, which means a collective freak out while our friends up north laugh. Um, Say it, but hey, we're here again today with another in our series of videos as we have been going through all of the non-immigrant visa categories, and now we're going through our immigrant visa categories. That means pathway to green card. And today specifically, we're going to be talking about the EB-4 category, employment-based fourth category. Now, the EB-4 actually has a whole bunch of different areas. Um, including Afghan and Iraqi translators, certain physicians, special immigrant juveniles. But Andrew, who are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about special immigrant religious workers. So
So,
essentially,
I was going to say, if you have an R visa, which is a non-immigrant religious visa, and you want thinking about residency, then this is the video for you, right? The next step in your process. So, Andrew, what is a special immigrant religious worker?
so very simply, this is a foreign national coming to work permanently in a full-time religious position within the United States.
I guess the first question I want to throw out there is that is this a category where someone can self-sponsor?
Yes, so ministers can actually self-sponsor.
But we do need to have a qualifying religious organization. It's kind of
Right.
like I guess our first step here is to look at, well, who can be a petitioner in this type of case. So we're looking at what is considered a bona fide religious organization.
Yeah, so a bona fide religious organization is a religious organization that is exempt from taxation according to what's called Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. So essentially, a religious organization under the 501c3 category.
Well, now we're going to hit our first little roadblock here. If you've already gotten the R, this is probably not going to be a problem. This mostly affects religious organizations that are doing this for the first time, trying to sponsor a foreign national. Because, question, to be exempt from taxation because I'm a church, just in general, do I need to make any type of application to the IRS in general?
So, in general, no. But for immigration purposes, you do have to get what's called a valid determination letter from the IRS that establishes that the group or organization belongs uh, is a tax exempt organization according to the IRC 501c3.
So again, if you've gotten an R visa and you're looking at residency in the same organization, this really shouldn't be an issue. But let's say you're thinking of changing organizations to a new one to sponsor you for residency. It has to have an IRS determination letter, period, end of sentence. It's required. Of course, the most common pushback we hear is, well, the IRS doesn't require me to get this determination letter. Oh, I never got it. Why do I need it? Well, yeah, you're correct. The IRS doesn't require it, but USCIS does. So it is absolutely vital that the organization get one of these. Again, if you already have an R and you're looking at residency in the same organization, then clearly they already have one because you got the R, right? Because this is actually a requirement for the R visa too. Um, but it is possible that the organization that's sponsoring you doesn't necessarily have their own IRS determination letter, but that is because they are affiliated with religious denomination. So what do they mean by that?
So this would be a nonprofit organization that is not necessarily a church, but related to one. So things like Catholic Charities or Latter Day Saints charities.
So it is possible to that the organization that is the direct petitioner is a nonprofit affiliated with a church, not the church itself. Now, there are some attestations and stuff that have to be signed, right, by both organizations, essentially corroborating the affiliation between the two. And then, of course, what matters in this case is that the affiliated church has the IRS determination letter. So if it's like, again, this person is going to get a job in a religious occupation in Catholic Charities. Well, Catholic Charities doesn't have an Irish determination letter, but it's affiliated with the Catholic Church, which does. Right, so you have to establish both the affiliation and then that the principal church has the letter. And we see a number of these, with different largely charities, and sometimes they're actually church organizations. So sometimes you'll see a church that has this sub organization that is involved in like church planting, right? And it's affiliated with a larger church. Um, Here's another interesting question: could you hypothetically work for more than one religious organization?
Yes, I mean hypothetically, but generally, the organization that you would be working for does need to be the petitioner in this case.
Yeah, so this is more kind of like on the R side, where you could hypothetically have two different employers on your non-immigrant visa. I mean, when it comes to residency, you would typically only have one sponsor that's pushing that through. Another thing we tend to see is with larger church organizations, like, oh, I'm going to get um, an R not through this specific church, but maybe through like the diocese, right? And then that kind of allows you to move around between the different churches and within that, so you're not locked into one physical location. Um, so now, okay, qualifying religious organization. It's got to be a church with an IRS determination letter or a nonprofit affiliated with the church. Pretty straightforward. That IRS determination letter being the main sticking point. So we're going to move past the organization to the position, because a common problem we see is where they're like, well, hey, they offered me the job as the secretary at the church. And you're like, well, it's not really a religious occupation, although it is at a church. The day-to-day duties are not religious. So, what are the basic positions that qualify for religious workers?
So there's three that are listed out. So first, it's ministers of religion or professionals working in religious vocations or occupations, and then finally, other workers in religious vocations or occupations.
I love when they throw out just like other workers, and you're like, well, who's that? Seems to open the door for a lot of confusion. But anyway, okay, let's talk about a minister. So, what are the requirements to be a minister?
So, a minister is someone who is, first off, fully authorized by a religious denomination and fully trained according to the denomination standards to conduct religious worship and perform other duties usually performed by an authorized member of the clergy organization. After that, second, they're not a lay preacher or person not authorized to perform duties usually performed by clergy. Then third, they perform activities with a relational relationship to the, or sorry, rational relationship to the religious calling of the minister. And finally, they would work solely as a minister, although this can also include certain administrative duties that are just incidental to what a minister would normally do.
So, I mean, obviously, it is okay if it's like, hey, I got to do some paperwork. We got to talk finances from time to time. There are administrative duties that any religious person is going to have for the most part. Um, and those are fine as long as they're, just a small segment of what you're doing. But one of the key questions here is is the first one actually is fully authorized by religious denomination. Now, we know for a lot of different other visas and stuff, there's these really specific requirements in terms of training or education. So, Who did they set the standard for training or education for administer in statute or regulation?
So in this case, the standard is actually not decided by the regulations, but rather the regular requirements of the denomination. So really, you look at what is the standard for that denomination, and not something set out by USCIS.
Yeah, so really, it's like, well, what do the bylaws say of the church, or the rules and regulations of the church in terms of their hiring criteria? Does the person have to have an underlying religious degree, experience, whatever it may be? As long as the person's qualifications match what the church has established as its minimum qualifications, then that is okay. So it's really the church that gets to set that. Um, I mean, one of the other things we've already kind of discussed are those sort of duties that are incidental, in terms of these things with like administration. Oh, I got to answer some emails, and hey, we're having a meeting, or we're going to talk about, some stuff, maybe a little bit of maintenance and stuff. I mean, I saw a job description once that, like, I was looking at it, and it was like, upgrade and upkeep of the sound system, mowing the lawns. I mean, it was all of this stuff, right? And I was like, that I mean, just in terms of the overall duties, that looked really, really bad. So we kind of went back and said, okay, it's okay that he has these other duties, like, kind of, but we need to assign a percentage of time to each, so that way it's clearly shown that, like, hey, this one at the top that's like, hey, preach, is like 50%, and then like, help people is like 20%. Now, when mowing lawn is like, 30 minutes a week. So I mean, it was okay, and if it's starting to look a little like questionable, that's when you put percentages next to each of them, so you can show, yeah, even though like 5 out of 8 look like administrative duties, those 5 really only account for like 10% of the overall time, and those other 3 are 90%. So that could be a key, adding those percentages in. Um, so, what are the requirements for a religious occupation?
So a religious occupation has to meet four basic requirements. First, the duties have to primarily relate to a traditional religious function and be recognized as a religious occupation within that denomination. Second, the duties have to primarily relate to and be involved with inculcating or carrying out the religious occupation within the denomination. uh, Third, the duties cannot include primarily, administrative, supportive, or like janitorial maintenance work and things of that nature. Also can include fundraisers, solicitors, just folks focused on fundraising for the organization. And then finally, religious study or training for the religious work does not constitute religious work. So you actually have to be performing duties and not just studying, essentially.
Yeah, because you can get an F visa to pursue a degree in theology, or some type of religious studies, and so that's what they say. Look, get an F visa to do the study, and then when you graduate, you can get OPT, to kind of to do the training, right? Religious training, or even like a J, maybe, to do the any type of training. But anyway, um, again, it's, I would say, relatively open-ended. The key being that the duties primarily relate, um, to religious occupations. Um, how about a religious vocation? What do they mean by religious vocation? How do they define that?
So, religious vocation means that the religious worker has made a formal lifetime commitment through vows or ceremonies or some kind of similar indicia, and then it's the religious way of life, and then also the religious denomination has to have a class of individuals whose lives are dedicated to religious practice or function that distinguishes them from secular members of that religion. So this would be things like nuns or monks, brothers, sisters, that sort of thing.
Does the religious occupation or the position offered have to be full time?
Yes. So in this case, the position actually has to be full time versus the R1 where you can see part time work.
So another, we're going to kind of circle back to the earlier question is, hey, can you self petition?
Yes. So a minister may self petition, but they have to produce all of the evidence from their proposed employer that is normally produced from an employer who's petitioning. So this would be essentially like they have all of the degrees and license or whatever within that denomination to practice.
Sorry, we see this a lot with some other categories like the EB-1A extraordinary ability, EB-2 national interest waiver, where you can self petition, but in a lot of cases, you do have to kind of produce evidence as to, well, who's going to pay you or who's going to support you or who's interested in what you're doing to say, well, yeah, I'm technically self-petitioning, but I may still have to produce like employee, like an employment contract or offer or, contracts that someone's like wanting to use my services. And so it's like, you can't just show up and say, I'm a minister. Just like, well, where are you going to minister? Right. I mean, I guess you know, there has to be something else there. Like it could be like, for example, maybe a church that you owned or founded, right? But there's a church there. Um, so it's like, yes, you can, but still you're gonna have to produce some evidence to show, well, where are you going to be ministering and how are you going to be ministering. Um, so let's talk about pay because hey, that's what everyone likes to talk about in church is money. Um, is there any set salary requirements like there are, like, for example, with H-1Bs and then the whole perm process, the EB-2, EB-3 perm that has all of these prevailing wages?
So, unlike those other categories, there's no prevailing wages set for this category, but whatever the organization sets is what they intend to pay. They do have to show the ability to pay that. So, they'll have to produce things like bank statements.
Ability to pay is kind of like the one common thread through all of employment-based residency applications, EB-1, 2, 3, 4. It's like you kinda have to be able to show that whatever you're offering this guy, that you can pay it. The easiest way is they're already working for you. Like, so if they're already working for you on an R, and you say, "Hey, I'm going to pay him $35,000 a year." Oh, and by the way, look, here's a W-2 from where I paid him last year and his pay stubs. That's the easiest, right? If not, you have to like produce bank statements um, to show you have the funds. So what about because this is kind of maybe a little bit more unique to the religious occupation, but what about non-salary compensation?
So the organization would have to provide some sort of evidence if they're providing things like room and board or a housing allowance, paid time off, insurance, things of that nature.
I think a common one in religious occupations is housing. Either they live, there's like a house kind of next to the church, or the church owns a house where the pastor lives. I mean, that's actually a pretty common one to see. And again, if that's going to be sort of in addition to, hey, we're only paying $20,000 a year, but he gets free room and board. Well, great. Just produce some evidence of it to back it up. Um, for example, if we're doing a minister who's self-petitioning, you know, can they essentially support themselves?
Yes, but in that case, they would have to show how they're going to do that. Is this funds that they've already received, or their own savings, or basically how are they going to go about it?
And it is something that we see fairly commonly in the R context, in the EB-4 context, where, sometimes they're coming from a country where the church in the foreign country, the members raised the money to actually support this person while they're in the US. So they may actually be receiving funds from the church abroad that was kind of sponsoring them to kind of come and be at this church in the US. That actually see that fairly often. At least, sponsoring part of the costs, like such as like the travel and some of the other stuff. Okay, so now we've gone through, hey, who's the sponsor? What's the position? Of course, now we're drilling in. Well, what about the beneficiary? What about the person actually applying? What do they have to be able to prove or show?
Uh,
Um,
so
so, what are the requirements as a beneficiary?
So for the beneficiary, they must have been a member of the petitioning religious denomination or the same type of religious denomination for at least 2 years immediately preceding when they filed the petition. And also, they have to have been working full time for a particular vocation, occupation, or related occupation.
So, this is one of the biggest distinguishing factors between the R and the EB-4. You know, they're in terms of the requirements, they're like 90% the same. There's a few minor differences. And this is one of them because to get an R, you just have to show that you've been a member of that denomination, not that specific church, but of that faith, of that denomination, right? So you can say, well, I'm Catholic. I've never gone to this church in Texas, but I go to a Catholic church in Mexico, right? I'm the same faith, but just a member, right? That's sufficient to get the R. But for the EB-4, you have to show that you've actually been working in a religious occupation for 2 years. So some people were a pastor, they get the R, and then they can immediately file the EB-4 because they can use that experience from, let's say they're in Mexico. Or you have other people who, like, maybe they came to school on an F, got their degree in theology, then got their R, right? So great, they met the requirements for the R because they've been a member of the denomination, but they actually have no experience in religious occupation. Meaning we have to wait 2 years before we can actually file the EB-4 because they don't have that experience in religious occupation immediately preceding the filing. Meaning you can't say like, hey, I don't know, I was a pastor for 10 years and I went on worked on Wall Street for the last four. You're like, well, it says immediately preceding. So great that you have that 10 years of experience, but it doesn't really help us in the EB-4 context. You're going to have to actually uh, work. I don't know, but maybe they were doing both. But then there's also issues around that experience. Was it full time? Was it part time? That can also create issues. Um, if it was less than 35 hours a week, um, as to whether or not it qualifies. So I guess the other question is, hey, do they have to? Does that experience have to be with that specific church that's sponsoring it?
No, so it doesn't have to be that specific church, but it does have to be still full-time, actual religious work within that same denomination.
Yeah, again, so that means if you're a pastor at a Methodist church in Mexico, and then you come to a Methodist church in the US, you can use that experience, right? Because it was immediately preceding, it was in a religious occupation, and it was all within the same, faith, right? So you could use that 2 years of experience. And pretty much get an R and then immediately file for the EB-4. So, and then again, we talked a little bit before about, hey, in terms of what do they have to have in terms of experience and education in general, that's set by the church, right? So you just have to say, the church says, hey, they need a degree, great. You just get a good degree, and you have to demonstrate all that. Main thing to remember always with USCIS is everything has to be documented. They'll never take your word for it. You can't just say, hey, the church says they require a degree in theology and he has a degree in theology. It's like, well, no, pull out the bylaws, highlight where it says that, and then get his degree. And if it needs to translate it, because you can't send him anything in a foreign language. So it's all documented. Otherwise, you're going to get a request for evidence. Not because necessarily they're trying to be mean or they're stupid. It's just because they want to see everything that you state be backed up with verifiable evidence. And then usually when you give them the evidence and they're like, cool, and they prove it, right? So for most of our EB categories, EB-1, 2, 3, right? When we actually file with USCIS, we file what's called Form I-140. That's where the petitioner or self-petitioner is filing with immigration to for them to be sponsored as a permanent employee rather than a temporary employee. So for our EB-4s, are we using an I-140 or doing something different?
No. So for the EB-4s, we file what's called an I-360. So like you mentioned, this was for a lot of different special immigrant categories, special immigrant juveniles and alike. But for the EB-4 special immigrant religious workers, it's the I-360 that they have to file with USCIS.
And what is our current processing time on an I-360?
Currently, it is between 23 and 30 months. And just kind of moving through some of these other points, you currently cannot concurrently file your adjustment of status with the I-360, and there's also no premium processing available. So this is really important for folks here on an R1 that are wanting to shift to a permanent position, and switching over to residency. You want to do it right after you get that 2 years of full-time employment done so that you can actually get it done before you run out of time on the R1.
Well, let's break that down a little bit, right? Because under your EB-1 through 3, you a lot and there's a lot of cases in which you can concurrently file. You file your I-140 and your I-485, your application for residency together. Now, there's some exceptions there for backlogged categories like Chinese and Indian nationals filing in EB-2, EB-3, right? If you're an Indian national filing in like EB-3, your employer files I-140, and then you wait 13 years, and then you file your 485. It's ridiculous, right? But, in general, you're able to just move from A to B or file them together. The I-360, they don't allow concurrent filing, and that's an issue because if you're thinking about the EB-4, that means you're probably here on an R, and the R has a hard cap at 5 years. So it's 2.5, 2.5, 5, you're done. There's no extensions like the H has what's called AC-21. It's sort of an update to the laws that allow for extensions beyond the cap if you're in a backlog category. Well, there's no such thing for Rs. So if you're having to wait 2 years from in order to file, that means you're entering your third year when you're filing your I-360, and you need that I-360 to be approved and to file your I-485 before your 5 years runs out. Meaning there's no room for error here. If you're going to go from R to EB-4 and you don't have experience in religious occupation, you need to be filing that EB-4 right when you hit the 2-year mark, or you run the risk of essentially having to leave the country and then finish the residency process from abroad because your clock ran out. Well, here's my other question, right? Are all of the is EB-4 current across the board?
Um, Last time I checked, I want to say yes, unless Mexico is still backlogged.
Um, so the one you have to look at is Mexico and El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They group those three together. Everybody else is current. So when the I-360 is approved, you can immediately file for residency. But Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are backlogged. In this case, Mexico right now, they're doing April 2020, and El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, they're doing March 2019. Um, Again, it depends on which, because there's two different charts, and sometimes they use the first chart, sometimes they use the second chart. So, for example, right now, if they're using the second chart, then Mexico is actually current and not backlogged. So you do have to pay attention to that, because even if you do file right at the 2-year mark and it gets approved, I don't know, in 20 months, if you're from, let's say, Honduras, there could be an additional wait there in order to file your I-45 application for permanent residency. So again, I don't know why they haven't made any exceptions or anything here when it's taking them that so long. I mean, I guess what's frustrating is I can see why they don't want to premium process the I-360 because it includes so many other categories that take more time. But it seems like they should make a carve out to say, hey, specifically I-360 EB, religious workers, you can file premium processing, but not the other people that use the I-360. Like, it seems like they should make that carve out, but they don't. Andrew, but here's the other thing you have to keep your eye on. Is the EB-4 religious workers a permanent program?
No, it's not. Get the exact terminology, but it is something that has to be renewed.
So the two things that have to be renewed are EB-5 regional centers and EB-4 religious workers. They're actually not permanent programs. And so there has been moments, they usually get EB-5 got separated recently, but historically EB-4 and EB-5 got tied in with the budget. So every time you hear them talking about government shutdown, pass a new budget, well, if when we have had those government shutdowns, those periods, the 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it was, I mean, technically EB-4 religious went away. Like, it didn't exist anymore, right? Because it hadn't been reauthorized. Now they did reauthorize it again, but they did not reauthorize EB-5. It somehow got separated from the budget stuff and put on its own path, and then I guess forgotten about. Um, so unfortunately, we have not had EB-5 regional centers for a number of months now. But that's another thing to keep your eye on, is that there could be a scenario where your I-360 gets approved, but just because of shenanigans within Congress, you may not actually be able to file your I-45 right away. If at that moment it's either backlogged or has not been authorized and essentially just gone. Um, the way you know that is you go look at the visa bulletin, and if you go right now and look at EB-5 regional centers, it says U for unavailable. Um, and so if you ever see that show up under EB-4 religious, the program hasn't been reauthorized. Now, again, it's mostly never been more than like a couple of weeks without getting reauthorized. But who knows? Maybe they could do an EB-5 thing and separate it, and then it gets forgotten about. That would be terrible. But the key to note here is that this is a viable program. We do handle a lot of these cases. Andrew, any final thoughts, comments on the EB-4 religious?
No, I think we covered.
So, hey, look, if you have any questions, let us know, whether it be about the R or whether it be about the EB-4. In either case, we can assist and help preparing you and submitting your application. Go to our website to schedule a consultation if you want to talk with one of us about your case in more detail. You can look us up on all the different social medias. Also, download our app, Law Pilot Guardian. It is free on Android and iOS and has a lot of great free features. There are some paid features, but you can download it. There's a lot of great free features there, and we're always adding new ones all the time as we integrate it with our case management software. But other than that, hey, if this wasn't the video for you, go check our series of videos. We're almost there, where we've kind of covered all of the bases. I think the only one we're missing now is we're going to do a big series on the EB-2, EB-3 perm labor certification, and then the EB-5, both the direct investment and regional centers. But we've already done pretty much all of the non-immigrant visa categories. So if there's something you're interested, go look. Leave a comment, ask a question. Otherwise, hey, thank you for tuning in and watching this video, and stay tuned for our next one. Thank you.